Welcome to the France 24 debate, where today we focus on Iran and the first presidential election there since the landmark agreement of 2015, when Tehran agreed to roll back its nuclear program in exchange for an end to most international sanctions. How's that likely to play out in Friday's vote? Have the Iranian people felt any economic benefits? And what implications is the election likely to have for the country itself and its relations with the international community? Well, joining me now to discuss those and other questions are by satellite from Washington, D.C., Ali Vaez, who's a senior Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group. By satellite from the Iranian capital, Tehran, we hope, Hamed Mousavi, who's a professor of political science at the University of Tehran. And here in the studio in Paris, Ardavan Amir Aslani, who's a political analyst and lawyer. But first, let's join our own Sanam Chantier, who's in Tehran, to report on the election. Sanam, for those of our viewers who don't really know very much about Iran and elections of this kind in Iran, what sort of atmosphere is there at the moment?
Well, since my arrival, I've been in the Iranian capital. You can certainly say the city has been gripped by election fever. People are very much aware that the two candidates can lead the country down very different paths. Initially, we were in northern Tehran, which is a more exclusive, wealthier district of the city, and majority of people were telling us they will be casting their ballot for Hassan Rouhani, a more moderate-leaning candidate. Now, also, the mood has been extremely jovial, both on the streets and in the campaign headquarters. We've seen people dancing and singing. Now, driving on Valia Ast, one of the longest avenues in the Middle East, it reminded me of Iran winning a football game, or even the celebrations of the nuclear deal, with people honking the car horns or even waving the purple ribbon, which is synonymous with Rouhani's campaign in the air. Now, I could hear the occasional chant of Akhar hafte Rouhani rafte, which means by the end of the week, Rouhani is gone. And that takes us to the support base of the hardline candidate, Ebrahim Raisi. Now, because of his populist speech, his appeal to the more working class, traditional sector of society, and certainly going to southern Tehran, which represents that sector of society, there was a combination of voter fatigue and people voting for him. They said to us, hopefully with this candidate, we can see palpable change, which we haven't seen during the Rouhani administration. Certainly when it comes to the economy, they also want a candidate that interestingly reminds them of Iran's former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
And Sanam, just one more question. What about the opinion polls, if indeed there are such things as opinion polls in Iran? What are they saying?
As you just said, opinion polls are extremely unreliable here in the Islamic Republic. The majority of them have put Rouhani ahead of his contender opponent, who is Ebrahim Raisi. And also, based on Iran's historical trends, every president has won a second term in the aftermath of the revolution in 1979. However, earlier I did see one poll by a conservative student media outlet that said Rouhani would be receiving some 42% of the votes. Again, I have to reiterate, and this comes from the Interior Ministry, they say these polls are invented and extremely unreliable.
Okay, Sanam Chantier in Tehran, thanks very much. I'd like to go now to Ali Vaez in Washington. Just a question that has occurred to me looking at the Western coverage this week of the election in Iran. It's in many respects quite dismissive, I would say. For instance, the Economist, talking about Iran's theocracy playing at electing a president. Is that an accurate, a fair reflection of the reality, do you think?
Look, it's true that the Iranian elections are unfree and unfair, but they're also unpredictable because they are truly competitive, meaning that once the candidates go through the filters that are created in the system, as you know, there's a guardian council that vets the candidates and weeds out the undesired ones, the competition between the remaining candidates is a true one, and it really has an impact. I think it suffices just to look at the experience Iran had in its relations with the West, and even in its management of its internal economy under the presidencies of President Khatami and Rouhani, and then compare that to Ahmadinejad. So yes, if you're looking at international standards of free and fair elections, these elections fall short. But if you talk about the impact, they're definitely very important.
And people, judging by the scenes that we've seen from Tehran, seem to be quite enthusiastic about the vote. Participation seems to be quite genuine.
Participation generally has been between 50 and 85% in the past 30 years. And I think the Iranian electorate over the years has realized that their participation matters. It helps in this election that on the same day, elections of city council and local council elections are taking place in parallel. And we're talking about up to 200,000 seats in these local councils around the country that will have to be filled. So there will be interest at the local level as well to take part in the elections. I think, relatively speaking, we will see a high turnout.
Ardahan Amir Hassani, I'd like to go to you now. The economy seems to have played a big part in this election, perhaps even the decisive one. It's been interesting, too, how in some respects it's almost replicated the election in the United States with a very populist drive, particularly from the Conservatives.
That is correct. In the person of Raisi, the Iranians have found their own populist demagogue. And the economy is of fundamental importance. And that is Rouhani's problem, as a matter of fact. His problem is that he over-promised and under-delivered in relation to the consequences of the nuclear agreement. He said that billions of dollars would come into Iran, rushing into the Iranian economy, contributing to an enhancement of the daily lives of the Iranians. Hundreds of thousands of corporations would be rushing towards the country. The economy would be booming, and Iran would become an El Dorado. That hasn't happened. Not that he didn't want that to happen. It couldn't happen because of remaining U.S. sanctions that are still in force, dating back to the early years of the Iranian Revolution, preventing dollar transactions, preventing project finance with Iran, preventing business being done by U.S. persons, and preventing basically freedom of access to the Iranian market. So there has been very insignificant improvements in the Iranian economy. It is true that he has managed to somehow stabilize the Iranian economy. The inflation is no longer in double digits, which by itself is a huge achievement since 30 years. We haven't seen this. Furthermore, the Iranian economy, gross national production, has increased substantially.
Is still very high.
Unemployment is there. And why? Because the GNP explosion is a consequence of newly recovering oil exports. But in reality, when you bring that down to the domestic economy, only 0.9% of growth has been witnessed. So there is not enough jobs for the Iranian people. And that's what they aspire to, have a decent living, be able to have a job, be able to rent a space to live, to get married. And this government of Rouhani, despite all its best efforts, because primarily of U.S. sanctions, has been unable to deliver. And it's not only that. It's about the economy for sure, but I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to discuss this further. It's also about stability in the region. When the Iranians look left, they fall on Daesh in Syria, and ISIS in Syria and Iraq. When they look right, they fall on the Taliban, the re-emerging and resurgent Taliban. And in the north and the south, they see hostile states surrounding Iran. So Rouhani, at the end of the day, no matter how successful his achievement has been, has brought a certain degree of stability to the Iranian economy and has brought stability to the Iranian neighborhood, because at the end of the day, there is no war in Iran, despite what's going on elsewhere.
I think we now have Hussein Mousavi joining us from Tehran. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
We were just talking there about the possible critical role that the economy is going to play in this election. Is it, in your view, in a sense, a referendum on Rouhani's economic policies?
Absolutely. The economy has been the #1 issue in this election. Essentially, Rouhani came into power 4 years ago on a mandate to improve the economy via a nuclear deal with Western powers. Now, he was successful in negotiating a deal with the Western powers. Nevertheless, as it was mentioned by your other guests, the expectation from the people were much greater, and it was actually Rouhani who promised a lot. Nevertheless, I think we should also point out that in the past 2 years, with the implementation of the nuclear deal, the United States has ceased the application of some sanctions on Iran. Nevertheless, it has imposed new sanctions. Just yesterday, the Trump administration imposed new sanctions on Iran. And what that is doing is it is discouraging people from investing in Iran. And as a result, Rouhani has been unable to fix the economy as people had expected. Inflation is down. Nevertheless, unemployment is pretty high. The official unemployment rate is 12.5%, but that the definition of unemployment by the government is if a person works only 1 hour a week, they consider that person employed. So realistically, the unemployment rate is perhaps in the 20s.
So unemployment probably in the 20s. The opposition, if you like, Mr. Raisi's campaign has based itself to a large extent on populist promises. But do the ordinary Iranian people have any faith? Do they believe in populist promises anymore? After all, that's all they got from Ahmadinejad. Are they going to make the same mistake again, do you think, and go for another populist?
Well, it really depends on who you ask. Essentially, let me first point out that in the past 3.5 decades, no sitting Iranian president has lost re-election. So the task of beating Rouhani is actually an uphill battle. Nevertheless, the weakness of the economy has essentially made Rouhani vulnerable. And Raisi is basically using that vulnerability. He is promising to fix the gap between the rich and the poor. One thing I should point out is that Rouhani and his team essentially have a free market capitalist approach to the economy. So as a result, in the past 4 years, they have worked towards privatization. At the same time, however, the gap between the rich and the poor has grown. And Raisi is trying to say that if I come into power, I'm going to implement social justice policies to fix that.
Does that work? Does it play well with the electorate?
It's very debatable. One of the things about Iranian elections is there is a great number of undecided voters. Even until today, with recent polls showing there is between 10 to 15% of undecided voters. So I think people are right now analyzing who can better fix the economy. Right now, it seems that Rouhani has a better chance of winning, though.
Ardavan, we've spoken about the external factors that have been dragging back the economy, the lack of investment, US sanctions. But what about some of the internal factors as well? Corruption, still a big issue in Iran.
Iran is unfortunately considered by specialized agencies as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. But at the end of the day, that is not the cause of the inefficiency that we have witnessed so far in relation to the lack of economic progress. The country itself has a number of issues. The bureaucracy is huge, cumbersome. Lack of transparency in the Iranian banking system is another big problem. You know, Iran was removed from the FATS, Financial Action Task Force, blacklist only less than a year ago. And the question is, will it be still kept off that list for another year or not? I think the answer is going to be positive. But, you know, going back to the elections issue and whether or not there is a lot of excitement in Iran, from what I've seen, I don't think there's a lot of excitement because the Iranian people, they're quite disappointed with Rouhani, and they are aware that whether or not Rouhani is elected, the economy is not going to change substantially because you're still going to have the erratic personality of Donald Trump in Washington breathing down the necks of the Iranians. So the economy is not going to change that much, and the Iranian people are aware. Yeah. In this election, it somehow resembles the French election. It's not that they're crazy about Rouhani, it's that they definitely, the vast majority of Iranians want to block the ascension to power of the other conservative candidate that in the mind of the Iranians personifies all that Rouhani does not personify. A reactionary attitude marked by regression and wanting to take back the Iranian people 25 years back. This no longer will work with the Iranian electorate. Right. They're going to vote against him, but maybe not in the hope of having Rouhani succeed in the economy.
Very, very briefly, Ali Vaez in Washington, before we come to the end of the first half, do you think the economy is going to be critical? Is it going to be the decisive factor? Or would you agree with Ardavan there that most Iranians are probably going to stick with Rouhani?
Look, it is the decisive factor, but the question is if the electorate really believes that Mr. Raisi, who has almost no executive experience, would be in a better position to manage internal economic issues in Iran, fight corruption. He has been in the judiciary for more than 3 decades, and look at the levels of corruption that Iran is now experiencing. So it's hard to imagine that Mr. Raisi will be better placed for fixing the economy internally and also externally. If we're complaining about the lingering US sanctions under President Rouhani, which presented the best face of the system to the outside world, imagine what happens with a president that already has a human rights record that would even make it difficult for the Europeans to side with the Iranians if the deal starts to erode.
Okay, well, I'll stop you there. That brings us to the end of the first part of the debate. Don't go away. We'll be back soon.